Hello, my dear friends. You're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 24th of November. Today we have some updates, so let's start. And first, we're going to discuss the report of Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation. This report was very interesting. The Russians provided a lot of updates about the front lines, about the clashes, about the Ukrainian attempts of offensive operation or something like this. But before this part of Russian report, they mentioned one important thing. They started the report with the note that as a result of missile attack all over the territory of Ukraine that took place on the 23rd of November, the Russians managed to achieve every single target. This was the first note from the Russians. And the second note was that as a result of that attack, the Ukrainians lost their possibility to deploy or move their forces using the railroad. And that was one of the most important part of that update. The Ukrainians, we can say that for one day or for, let's say, 4, 5, 6 hours, the Russians didn't provide the real number of hours that Ukrainians were out of railroad services. So the Ukrainians lost their possibility to deploy or redeploy or to move their forces all along the front line using the railroad. And this is very important. Just keep this information in your mind. And we will come back to this information a little bit later. Now let's talk about the front lines. The Russians reported that the Ukrainians were attacked the same direction, or they were trying to attack, they were trying to collect forces, but their Ukrainian forces were spotted by the Russians, and the Russians attacked those forces with artillery. And if we're talking about Kupiansk-Liman front line, the Ukrainians lost around 75 soldiers and something around 7 armored vehicles. As you can see, the losses are not so big. They're very small, and more Russian military experts are saying that that means that these days we can see that the front lines are stable and the front lines are calm, without any heavy clashes, without any attempts of penetrating or something like this. If we're talking about Seversk-Bakhmut front line, today we got interesting update from the Russian sources. They reported that as a result of heavy clashes on the line between Mayorsk and Kurdyumovka, the Russians managed to penetrate the Ukrainians' defense orders, and they managed to establish control over 6 checkpoints in this area, and finally they established the entire control over the area, over the towns that located on the north from Gorlovka. So these towns, including this residential area. So I believe that maybe these trenches in this area is already under Russian control. So they are very close. They got very close to the next Ukrainian fortification in the towns by the name of Azaryanovka, Kurdyumovka, Zelenopolye in this area. So they're moving from the south. If we're talking about South Donetsk or Donetsk area, the Russians reported that Ukrainians made few attempts of attack the Russians' fortification. They were attacked in direction of Nikolskoye, Pavlovka. The Ukrainians were attacked in direction of Vremivka tactical bridgehead, and the Ukrainians were attacking in direction of Priyutne, Novodarivka. So we can say so the Ukrainians tried to find the weak position in Russian defense orders, and the Russians reported that as a result of those attacks, the Ukrainians lost around 50 soldiers and 10 armored vehicles. If we calculate the entire losses all over the front lines according to Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, the Ukrainians lost during the previous 24 hours just 125 soldiers. I must say, and I believe that this is the lowest losses from the Ukrainian side since the beginning of the special operation. And that means a lot. Today, during the day, we got a lot of reports from the Ukrainian side that almost entire day Kiev was out of light, and many towns still remains without any electricity, water, and so on. But by this evening, we also got some reports from the Ukrainian side, from the Ukrainian authorities, that they managed to recover and restore the electricity almost all over the Ukraine. For now, at least, I haven't received any confirmation of that, but this is not the most important thing. If you remember, yesterday we discussed about possible upcoming offensive operation in the north of Ukraine and the area between the border of Belarus on the north and the northeast border with the Russians. And starting today, at least I found a lot of speculations, a lot of talks, a lot of projection from the Russian military experts who are saying that it's a very possible, there's a very big chance that the Russians during the December military campaign are going to attack the north of Ukraine in direction from Chernihiv and Sumy, as we discussed yesterday in my previous video. But the question is how to understand whether it's some kind of speculation or maybe this is the real plans from the Russian side. We discussed about some notes, some let's say announcement from Kiev authorities that mayor of Kiev reported and requested of immediate evacuation or possible evacuation of a third part of population of Kiev. We see that the front lines are stable in this area, but if we analyze these two factors, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that the Russians are planning to start anything or whatever we discuss in the videos or something like this. But today I continue analyzing the situation on the front lines, and as you know, a lot of sources are saying that, and we discussed this information also in my previous videos, that the Russians prepares the fortification, trenches and defense line along the Belgorod region in this area. So let's take a look at the Western sources map, and let's update the source map trying to show the defense line that the Russians are preparing these days on the border between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. So this is Belgorod, this town Belgorod, this the Belgorod border, and according to the Russian sources and the sources of Ministry of Ukrainian sources, the Russians prepares this defense line. So they're building, establishing, they're building a lot of trenches. They're building not just one line of trenches, they're building a lot of lines of trenches. There, maybe you saw this fortification by the name of Title of the Dragon. It's like some kind of wide fortification engineering constructions that the Russians chained between each other, and the Russians are building this fortification on this border. So the question is why the Russians prepare this fortification. A lot of military experts ask the same question, and the only answer they found is that maybe the Russians want to be on the safe side, and maybe the Russians expect the attack from the Ukrainian side from Kharkiv area in direction of Belgorod. This information we can say is 50% correct, but 50% is not correct. From the side that Ukrainians may attack in direction of Belgorod, yes, this is truth. But the reason why the Ukrainians would decide to attack Belgorod is completely wrong. So the Ukrainians don't have such plans to attack Belgorod to establish control over the capital of some Russian region or something like this. To understand why the Russians prepare defense line along the border with Ukraine, we need to understand or to answer the next question. Where else the Russians prepare fortification? And the second famous fortification that the Russians tries to prepare during these days is Wagner Line. I believe you saw videos, you heard about that the Wagner groups, they're trying, and these days they're preparing another big fortified area on the front line between Ukrainians and their territory. But the structure of that fortification is very interesting. The Russians, the Wagners, prepares fortification somewhere along this line. So they're moving from Svetlodarsk, from this area, to the north, in direction of Privolye, and after that the Russians turn to the south, and then they continued preparing their fortification along Seversky Donets River and right to the border, to the ex-border of LPR. This red line is the ex-border of LPR and DPR as well. If we take a look at the Russian sources map, I'm talking about this yellow line, and as you can see, there are along this line, a lot of fortification that the LPR and DPR forces have already prepared since 2014. So this X front line that we saw from 2014 till 2022. And believe me, there are a lot of fortifications. So we can say that Wagner's prepared new fortification on the front line, and they connect this fortification with the X fortification that we might see since the 2014. So as you can see, it's the completely connected fortification area. And now, as you can see, we see at least two powerful fortification areas. One of them is in Belgorod region, another one that Wagner's are preparing these days. And the third fortification, the Russians prepares along the road that connect Kremennoye Svatovo. So we can say that these days there is a third fortification area on this line. If we're talking about the north, the regular Russian army prepares, or the forces that locate in the territory of Russian Federation. If we're talking about the north of LPR, this fortification area is prepared by 20th Russian Army and the forces located here. If we're talking about this fortification area is under Wagner responsibility. So as you can see, according to this map, there is a line that started somewhere in Belgorod and ends somewhere on the top, on the north from this red line. And this red line is X fortification that we saw in 2014, 2022. So we can add another line in this area. So another fortification. So as you can see, most of the territories are well protected. If we are talking about Zaporozhye, I haven't received any reports or video confirmation that the Russians prepared such a powerful fortification as they did in those regions. But we know that the Russians did redeployment process from Kherson, and they managed to accumulate a lot of forces in Zaporozhye and Kherson district. There are a lot of forces. There are fortifications as well. But anyway, we can say that I haven't seen any video confirmation, but we know that there are a lot of forces. So the question is, I will repeat one more time, why the Russians prepared these fortifications. The easiest, the simplest answer is that Ukrainians may try to start counteroffensive operation. These days we got a lot of report that Ukrainians managed to accumulate a lot of forces near Kharkiv, in this area. Some Russian experts are saying that this is the evidence or some kind of fact saying that the Ukrainians collected a lot of forces in Kharkiv with one purpose, to attack in direction of Belgorod or to develop their offensive operation, like this is some kind of hub, or to develop their offensive penetrating operation in direction of Svatovo. So two reasons, and to tell the truth, all these two reasons have real background, we understand, but my understanding of the situation why the Ukrainians collected a lot of force in Kharkiv, because of the fact that this is the only town where the Ukrainians are able to deploy such a big army. They can deploy there. This town is very close to the front line, so there are no problems with reserves. There are no problems to move some forces to any front line just to stop the Russians if the Russians, let's say, started their own counteroffensive operation. So now let's discuss the situation about Kiev, and you will understand everything. Today, the Institute of Study of War gave another report, and according to their report, they projected that by the beginning of the January of 2023, so we can say that in a month, today is 24th of November, in a month, the Russians are planning to deploy around 500,000 army on the territory of Ukraine. We know that if we're talking about the south, there are around 2,500 soldiers already deployed on the battlefields. Another 2,500 is in mobilization process, they're in training centers and so on. And the thing is that the Ukrainians don't know, maybe know, who knows, where the Russians or Western countries don't know where the Russians are planning to deploy another 250,000 soldiers. As I told you yesterday, my projection is that the Russians will try to attack Kiev one more time. They need to complete and to continue this special operation. And you might say that maybe this is the reason why the Russians prepare such a powerful fortification area. This is one of the reasons, but the question is why the Russians need these fortifications if they're going to attack Kiev, and we understand that in this case the Ukrainians will have to move their forces, and they will be able to do this, to move their reserves from Kharkiv, from Dnipro, from Donetsk in direction of Kiev, just to stop the Russians. We understand this. And now we are going to discuss one of the most important things. I believe that the Russians prepared this fortification not to stop the Ukrainians, not to, I don't know, for any other reasons. The Russians prepared this fortification as one reason. They want to do another redeployment process. Maybe it's some kind of speculation on my side. I'm just trying to analyze and trying to understand what the Russians are planning to do. According to my understanding of the situation, if the Russians want to take control over Kiev one more time, 100,000 army is not enough for this. 200,000 army is not enough for this. I believe that if the Russians want to take control over Kiev and the north part of Ukraine, they need at least 300,000 soldiers. So, according to the Institute of Study of War, the Russians plans to deploy 500,000 army, including the number on the south on the territory of Ukraine. And I believe that from these 500,000, the Russians will deploy around 300,000 in the north. That means that the Russians will be forced to take some groups. Let's say if we are talking about Zaporozhye, if there are 50,000 soldiers, I believe that the Russians will take another 10 from the south and move them to the north. If we are talking about Donetsk, if there are, let's say, 60,000 soldiers, I believe that the Russians will take 15,000 and they will redeploy them to the north. If we are talking about the LPR and if there are 30,000 soldiers, I'm taking numbers not from the real, it's just like just to explain the situation. The Russians will take 5,000 soldiers and would redeploy them on the north. So this is the reason why the Russians prepare fortification. They're planning to make some kind of redeployment from all over the front lines and move as much as possible forces to the north. And now let's I remind you one more time the things that we started this video discussion from. That the Russians, according to the report, as a result of attack on the 23rd of November, managed to shut down electricity all over the Ukraine, and they managed to stop the railroad service in Ukraine. The Ukrainians didn't have any possibilities to move their forces from one town to another. They couldn't do anything. They were pinned down, they were freeze, they were stuck. And this is exactly what the Russians wanted to achieve. And now we understand that for now we don't see any movement because the Russians don't want to discover their plans. But believe me, as soon as the Russians will be ready, they will do the final massive rocket attack. They will shut down Ukraine and they will cut Ukraine from electricity for weeks, not just for one day. They will shut down them for weeks. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are stuck on the south. They will start redeployment process from the south of Ukraine to the north. And the Russians will establish their positions on the border of Belarus and, let's say, in Bryansk and Kursk Oblast. So this is the area where the Russians will redeploy their forces. I repeat one more time. This is my understanding of the situation and this is my projection. I might be completely wrong about this situation, but something tells me that the Russians are planning to do exactly the thing that we are discussing right now. If we take a look at deployment map, you're going to see that the north of Ukraine is completely out of soldiers. If we're talking about Chernigov, Sumy area, there are, according to the sources we have, there are just a few brigades, territory defense brigade that has around 6 battalions. So just the forces who doesn't have a lot of armored vehicles, artillery, and these forces are not able to stop the Russian army. In any case, they are not able to do this. If we're talking about the western part of Ukraine, there is the same situation. There are just territory defense who are not able to stop the Russians. Yes, they will be able to slow down, but they won't be able to stop. And it's just a question of maybe a few days when the Russians will be able to break this territory defense and they will be able to get as close as possible to Kiev. So this is the reason why, and in this case, the Ukrainians have just one option. So the Ukrainians see that their electricity system has been shut down by the Russians. They don't have possibilities to move their forces to the north to stop the Russians' deployment process and to stop the Russian invasion in direction of Kiev. So what the Ukrainians are able to do in this case? There is just only one option for them. The only thing they can do is to start offensive operation from Kharkiv, let's say in direction of Belgorod, because they don't need to send their forces very far to the north, to Kiev. They just need to start massive attack in direction of Belgorod. And of course, the Russians will be forced to stop, to slow down, to keep some reserve there who will fight with the Ukrainians. And this is the reason why the Russians prepare fortification, exactly for this case. As soon as they start redeployment process, the Ukrainians will attack, and the Russians need to be sure that their attack will be repulsed by them on every single front line from Belgorod to, let's say, Energodar. Also, this is the reason, another evidence about my theory, why the Ukrainians are not doing redeployment process from Kherson district. As you can see, according to the deployment map and according to information we have from the open source, the Ukrainians are not doing global redeployment from Kherson district, let's say to Donetsk, to Zaporozhye or Kharkiv. They're keeping their forces there. And the question is why they're doing this. And if we take a look at the Western Sources map, we're using this map just for one purpose, to understand the railroads and rivers and roads. And as you can see, according to this map, there is a straight railroad, or just a regular road from Nikolaev to the north, then to Kiev. So as you can see, sooner or later the Ukrainians might be able to restore electricity, or they will be able to use the trains that uses not the electricity but coal. And with help of this, they will be able to start redeployment process from the south in direction to the Kiev. If we're talking about this army that located on the left bank of Dnipro River, I'm not sure that Ukrainians will try these forces to move in direction of Kiev, and I will explain to you why. Furthermore, don't forget that yesterday there was a very big meeting of the defense allies of Belarus, Moscow, and other islands allies according to the defense bloc, and they would talk a lot. And the president of Belarus reported that the destiny of this defense bloc completely depends on the situation and the special operation, on the result from the special operation in Ukraine. And also the president of Belarus told us that if Zelensky is not going to start negotiation process, then not just the Ukraine as a power will disappear. The entire Ukraine will be destroyed. This is his words, and this is his words after this meeting of the leaders of this defense bloc. Now let's talk about Kiev and possible Kiev offensive operation. If we are talking about this area, there are at least something around 4 important points that the Russians won't be able need to take if they want to get in direction of Kiev. Of course, there are a lot of options about Ukraine. There is Dnipro River that split Kiev in 2 parts, and the question is what the Russians want about the Kiev. Just to get as close as possible and to start artillery shelling of this town to force Zelensky to start negotiation, or the Russians want to take control over entire Kiev. If the Russians want to get just as close as possible, in this case they don't need to attack Kiev from the left bank of the river, so from this side, from the territory of Belarus, because they don't need this. It's very, let's say, dangerous operation, and there are going to be a lot of losses, of course. If they just want to get as close as possible, they can attack from this area. If they want to take control over entire Kiev, they need to attack from both sides, as they did in the February of 2022. And let's discuss the plan if the Russians plans to attack and to take control over entire Kiev. For these purposes, with a big army, they need to take control over few points. First one is Korostin. This town is located almost on the border between Belarus and Ukraine. And this town is located on the railroad that connects Kiev with Poland. So this is a very important town to take control over, just to reduce supply and support of Kiev. Another town that the Russians need to take control over or area is Zhytomyr. This town is located on the south from Korostin. Without taking Zhytomyr, it's almost impossible to discuss and talk about the next offensive operation direction of Kiev. So this is two important towns that located on the west, and without taking control over this town, the Russians won't be able to take control over entire Kiev. If we're talking about the east part, about this area, of course, we need to talk about Chernigov. This is the first town the Russians need to establish control over. Without taking this town, we have experience already. We saw what happened with the Russians when they tried to pass Chernigov, or to came around this town in direction of Kiev. Chernigov made a lot of problems for the Russians, and now they understand that they need to take this town without any doubts. And of course, the most important point that the Russians need to take control over is this one, this railroad cross. So if the Russians are able to take these 4 points, we can say that Kiev will be encircled. It's like the first stage, and the Ukrainians, they will still have the road to supply this town along the Dnieper River from the south. Using these forces that located in Kherson, they will be able to redeploy them in a week, using if they will be able to restore electricity, or to use the trains that use coal to go to the north. Maybe they will be able to stop or to slow down the Russians. Another very important area where the Russians are going to use is, of course, to cut the road that connects Kharkiv, Sumy, Kiev, this one. By the time the Russians take control over Pyryatin and Gribenka, this town, and we understand that by that time this road will be cut. But meanwhile, the Russians need to attack Sumy as well. And to encircle, and of course, to take this capital of this region, and the main goal, of course, to take control over this road and cut the road that connects Kharkiv and Sumy. So this area should be taken as well. If the Russians are not planning to take Sumy, then they can step back or to regroup to the north and to restore connection, because the Ukrainians anyway won't be able to move their forces from Sumy to Kiev. So the Russians first will attack in direction of Korostin from this territory. Then they will try to develop their offensive operation in direction of Zhytomyr. Meanwhile, they will try to attack Chernigov, let's say from many directions, trying to encircle and take control over this town. And after Chernigov, the Russians will move as close as possible to the border of Kiev region. And meanwhile, they will try to attack to the south. And of course, they will try to take and return control over Konotop. This town used to be under Russian control during the first phase. This is the plan that the Russians goal that the Russians may achieve with the very big army that they're deploying these days on the north of Belarus, and that they will complete deployment as soon as they will destroy entire energy facilities of Ukraine, and if Ukrainians are not going to start negotiation process. As you can see, if we're talking about this part, if the Russians are able to take these 2 towns, the Kiev will be completely cut off from the forces that located in Donbass and Kharkiv from the east, just to take these 2 points. It's not an easy job, but with the help of big army that the Russians have, and with complete energy facility shut down, the Russians are able to do this. But anyway, Chernigov is a very big town, and this town should be taken with a storm, with a very fast storm to enter this town. And believe me, there are going to be a lot of losses, but the Russians need to win some time, and they need time more than anything in this war. They need to have success, and they need to be always the first. And the same if we're talking about Korostin. This is a very small town, and I believe that the Russians are able to take this town maybe in a day or in two. The same situation as Chernigov we can see in Zhytomyr. This is also a very big town if we compare with the rest town, and of course the Russians will have the same amount of losses in Zhytomyr as in Chernigov. But as soon as they got these two towns, we can say that we can start counting days before Kiev is going to fall. And as soon as the Russians got control over Zhytomyr, I believe that they will not develop offensive operation in direction of Kiev. I believe that they will go a little bit to the southeast in direction of Fastov. During the previous phase of this special operation, the Russians were trying to get Fastov. As you can see, this blue cloud shows that the Russians moves, and then they would try to start development to the south, but they were stopped by the Ukrainians, and by the time almost the end of the March has come, and the Russians decided to leave this area and to retreat from this from the north of Ukraine. And Fastov, and if we're talking about the real first battle for Kiev, we're going to see exactly in Fastov. And the destiny of Kiev will be solved in this area. And if the Russians are able to take control over Fastov, that means that Kiev will be completely encircled from the west, because the Ukrainians, from that very moment, the Ukrainians won't be able even to use this railroad, because from Fastov all these roads will be under fire, and the Ukrainians will have a lot of losses during movements or redeploying their forces in this direction, if they will have such possibility to do this. If the Russians take Chernigov, they will start development their offensive operation in direction of Konotop, and the most important one is in direction of this, let's say, residential area. There are not much towns in this area and not much places where the Russians are able to prepare fortification during the winter period. So this area is going to be, let's say, if Fastov is the main battle on this bank of the river, the battle for this region is going to be the main battle on the east side of Dnipro River. And if the Russians are able to establish control of this area, the entire Kiev will be encircled. So I believe that we are going to see exactly like this. The Institute of Study of War reported one more time that the Russians are planning to deploy 500,000 army. I don't think that it's a good idea to deploy these forces in Zaporozhye and Kherson district. What for? The Russians won't be able to cross Dnipro. I don't think that the Russians are going to deploy 500,000 army in Zaporozhye. What for? To attack Gulyai-Polye and Orekhov, where we can see significant fortification engineering constructions, to lose soldiers one by one in waste, in the stupid attack in front of this fortification. To deploy forces in Donetsk for what purposes? To attack fortifications that were built since 2014. There are a lot of lines, and this 500,000 army will be reduced till zero by the time the Russians get Pokrovsk. It's very highly unlikely. Furthermore, you need to understand, 500,000 army is a very big army, and the Russians pays a lot of money to these soldiers, and every single month is another month of very big expenses to the Russian budget. So they need to have a very fast operation for one reason: to stop this war, to force Ukraine to start negotiation process, to take more lands, or maybe to do some coup in Ukraine, and to stop this war. Nobody can afford itself such a big army, to pay such big salaries, and to afford such a war. It's very difficult for any budgets, and the Russians don't want problems among their civilians, because they understand that the war is paid with the pocket of citizens of Russian Federation. It's a very difficult, very expensive war for the Russians. Furthermore, they need to build a lot of equipment, drones, and so on. Very difficult. And I don't think that the Russians will deploy their forces in LPR. What for? To start a counteroffensive operation in Kharkiv area. What for? This area is completely reduced to ruins. And just to return the territories that they lost during the Ukraine counteroffensive operation. What for? No reason to do this. To encircle Kharkiv. What for? The Russians, let's say the Russians take control of Kharkiv. What does it change? It changed nothing. It changed that just the numbers of the Russian army, because if the Russians want to take Kharkiv, their losses will be very big. Furthermore, to encircle Kharkiv is much difficult than to encircle Kiev, because there are a lot of fortification. There is a real regular Ukrainian army who can stand against the Russians, and they will slow down them. This is the only possible option. Of course, you might say that another possible area to attack from the Russians is from the west part of Belarus in direction of the south. So let's say the Russians may choose this direction to attack. This is also an option. In this case, the Russians need to at least get Ternopil, this town. If the Russians are able to get Ternopil by attacking the west part of Ukraine, and let's say to establish control over, let's say, this area, they can also solve a lot of problems, this small back. By this attack with a very big army, they can do this, they can develop a lot of progress, and they need just to get Ternopil. And the only thing that left for Ukraine is just a small piece of land that Ukrainians will use to supply and support Ukrainian army with the Western weapon. And believe me, this is not enough to supply this entire big army, and from this area the Russians will easily control this territory, and we can say goodbye to any Western supply and support. But the Russians won't do this, and I will explain to you why the Russians won't attack exactly in this area. This is a very nice attack, but there are a lot of risk. First of all, in this case, the Russians will be very close to the Poland border, to be more precise, to the NATO border. And to have heavy active clashes near Poland border is very risky, and the Russians don't want to shut down the Poland plane or NATO plane, or to send a rocket by mistake on the territory of Poland, or to have some provocation from the Ukrainian side when they send some rocket across the Russian controlled territory in direction of Poland. And it's very risky, and the Russians don't want to have such a risk. So is this the first reason the Russians want to be as far as possible from the Poland border, at least at this stage of the operation. And the second reason why the Russians won't use this attack is that the Russians do a very big risk by redeploying their forces and by moving all their army, all their mobilized forces to the north. They're doing a very big risk. In this case, the Russians won't be able to move their reserves to the south, to Donetsk, to LPR, or if the Ukrainians, let's say, manage to penetrate the Russian defense near Belgorod, or and the Russians need to send reserves. If they deploy their forces in the west part of Belarus, it will be very difficult to send reserves from this area in direction of Belgorod. It's a very big distance. It will take weeks before the Russians will be able to deploy their forces in this area. So this is the reason why the Russians want to deploy their forces on the area between Mozyr of Belarus, Gomel, Bryansk, Kursk, in this area. From one side, this is not very far from their main forces that located here, not very far. At least it's much closer than from Belarus, from the west part of Belarus, because it will take a lot of time to redeploy forces. And furthermore, in this case, the Russians will be able maybe to do some flanks attacks from the north, and they will be able to pin down these forces. And if something goes wrong, the Russians always will have possibilities and time to send some reserves to the south. If something goes wrong, let's say on this front line, if this fortification is not enough, let's say for possible Ukrainian counteroffensive operation that they will do, because the Ukrainians won't have any other option. If the Russians shut down the electricity and send their forces to the north, the Ukrainians won't have any other option just to attack the Russians all over the front line and force them to slow down, to stop, and to move their reserves back. So I see this picture as I described you right now. I believe that by the end of this year we are going to see something. I believe the projection of Institute of Study of War, because I must say that the previous few projections came true, like the situation with Kherson. If you remember in my previous videos, I told you that Institute of Study of War projected that the Russians would leave Kherson like in 2 weeks before the Russians did this. The same situation, the same projection was about the north of Kupiansk, they projected the same, that the Ukrainians will take and liberate this territory, let's say, in a week, and they did this. So if Institute of Study of War says that the Russians are planning to deploy 500,000 army by the end of this year, I believe that they will deploy back on the north. For now, I think that the Western countries maybe don't have real picture. They have, of course, they have a lot of plans, a lot of things. They analyze, they calculated everything, they calculate everything, and I believe that they have this plan as well. And maybe this is the reason why the Ukrainians started building fortification around Kyiv, because they're doing this right now. This is the reason why Ukrainians announced about the evacuation process, because they analyze and they see the risks. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you, we condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.